Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first presentation of the year, the 2025. Um, I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the speaker program for Military History and Heritage Victoria, and on behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight, we're pleased to have Mike Carlton again, presenting Dive, Australian Submariners at War. Submariners at War. Now, a little bit about Mike. In a working life of more than 50 years, Mike became one of Australia's best-known media figures. He's been a radio and television, news and current affairs reporter, foreign correspondent, radio host, and newspaper columnist. He was ABC war correspondent in Vietnam in 1967 and 1970, and for 3 years was ABC's bureau chief in Jakarta. He also reported for the ABC in London, New York, and major Asian capitals. In television, he was one of the original reporters of ABC's groundbreaking This Day Tonight in the 1970s. He also worked for Channel 9 Network News and A Current Affair. 1980, Mike started a distinguished career in talk radio with a top-rating breakfast program on Sydney's 2GB and in London at News Talk, where he won a coveted Sony Radio Academy Award for Britain's best talk breakfast show. His radio satire on current affairs, Friday News Review, was must listening in Australia and UK. In television, he's reported and hosted Indonesia. The Reporter returns a three-part doco for SBS, and he's worked on Radio 2UE as a broadcaster for many years. And he wrote a long-standing column for the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, before Mike proceeds, he'll be just a bit of house rules. Most of you have heard it before, but anyway, Mike will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, and he can do this in one of two, or you can do this in one of two ways, that is, ask questions. If you're feeling shy, post a chat message anytime up to and including question time and address it to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read out the questions using your name that comes up on the computer screen. Or you can wait and have your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask the questions verbally. Mike's happy to have the screens on, but remember, everyone can also see you. And if you've got your microphones on, they can hear you. By now, you should be in speaker view, and I invite Mike to speak.
Hey, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here this evening. I hope I do better than the last time I was with you in person. I had raging gastroenteritis. I nearly exploded. It was a shocker. But I'm a bit better this time. It is always nice to be with people who care a bit about history, a lot about history, and who cherish it and who want to talk about it. So it's a privilege to be with you. After four books of naval history, I thought I'd gone about as far as I could go. First War, Second World War, and been there, done that. But the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, invited me to have a coffee with him one morning. We never met, and we thought we would. So we met at a little cafe at Woolloomooloo, just across the road from the big fleet base at Carlton Island. And he asked if I had any plans for another book, and I said no, I didn't have a topic, nothing that jumped up and grabbed me. And he said, well, what about submarines? It won't come as any surprise to you to learn that he's a submariner himself. He wears that Twin Dolphins badge that you earn, that you win, that you pass. It makes you a submariner. And he's only the second submariner ever to have the top job running the Navy. So it seemed like a good idea, worth a thought. So I went away and had a poke around online, just scratching the surface to see what was there. And I was first intrigued and then more and more excited by what I found. And it's always good when you're starting off with a topic about which you know absolutely nothing. It's really exciting to find there's stuff there you can look at. The Royal Australian Navy Submarine Service has a rich, vibrant, a proud past. And there's a goldmine, a treasure trove of stories there I found waiting to be told. It was a bit daunting at first. I figured I had the surface Navy pretty well sorted out, how ships and sailors behaved and so on, how they went about it. But the underwater Navy is a very different animal indeed, very different. Uh, the boats are different for a start, and they are called boats too, not ships. The very first pioneering primitive submarines were boats, and the name has stuck since the 19th century. And even the big Russian and American submarines that come in at 10,000 tons or more, they're still boats. The men, and now the men and women, of course, too, they are different as well. I found that it takes a special kind of sailor to turn away from a career in the surface fleet, all that fresh air and sunshine and so on, to follow a life at sea where you'll spend weeks, even months on end, living and working, eating and sleeping in a metal tube lit by electric light, breathing recirculated air, uh, cheek by jowl with another 50 or 60 people or so, who you get to know very, very well. It's a unique existence and not for everyone. For a start, it smells. You can't avoid it. Your clothes reek of, in the Australian submarine, your clothes reek of diesel fuel, of cooking fumes, of just body odors. It's like that, and it's constant, unremitting. I know damn well I couldn't do it. But it was a tremendous pleasure and a privilege to meet these people, mostly retired submariners who were a delight to know and were only too willing to help me understand how it all works. As I say, surface ships are pretty much new, whether they're an aircraft carrier or a tugboat. They behave in pretty much the same way. And submarines on the surface do the same things too. They're governed by the same laws of physics and the rules of the sea. But from the moment a submarine begins to dive, uh, they and their crews are in an entirely different realm, and you've really got to try and grasp that. It presents great hazards, great dangers if it all goes wrong, for whatever reason. And every submarine sailor is very aware of that. If only in the back of his or her mind, they know it. And even after a century and more of submarines, the possibility of disaster, of death, is never very far away. It's on the edges, it's on the margins. It is that serious. If a surface vessel, its engines break down or it loses power for whatever reason, it glides to a halt and sits there. In a submarine, it goes to the bottom. That's the difference. And it is a melancholy fact that a lot of Australian submariners have died in the line of duty, mostly in war, but in peacetime as well, it's happened, and not all that long ago. Uh, Others have stared death in the face and survived by a hair's breadth. In 2003, not that long ago, one of our current Collins class boats, HMAS Duchesneau, was almost lost off Western Australia when a simple seawater hose burst as she was at her maximum diving depth. Now, that's well below 300 meters. They don't give away the diving depth, it's a secret, but it's below that. And this hose burst when she was there, flooding the engine room in seconds. And it was a nothing. It was, $25 piece of hose. The boat came quite literally within 20 seconds of disaster. Incredible rush of water pouring in under pressure, very nearly killed one of the sailors. And she would have gone to the bottom in 20. She was saved only by the courage and skill of her captain and crew who lived to tell the tale. The captain, Peter Scott, who retired as a Commodore, he was a tremendous help to me in writing this book. But it was that close, 20 seconds. If another 20 seconds worth of high pressure water had flooded in, the boat couldn't have handled it. Our first loss, and still our greatest submarine loss, was in just the opening weeks of the First World War. AE1, the A stood for Australia, was an E-class boat, the A for Australia on the front. AE1 was the name, back in the days when submarines only had numbers, not names. And she was our brand new Navy's very first submarine. And she simply vanished while on patrol near the Duke of York Islands, what was then German New Guinea. And this is one of the strange things I discovered writing the book. Almost nobody in Australia these days is aware that the Germans owned most of the island of Papua New Guinea. It was their colony. And off east as well, they had Nauru, they had New Britain, they had Rabaul. It was all theirs. Nobody knows that there was a German enemy sitting on top of us, just waiting, and all patrolled by a very efficient German naval squadron. So AE1 was up there looking around, and on the 14th of September 1914, so only a few weeks into the war, she just vanished. The war was less than 2 months old, and all on board perished with her. 34 officers and men went to the bottom. The life just crushed out of them as the submarine imploded. A terrifying death, you would think, although mercifully quick. And there they remain, in the beautiful words of the naval ode. You'll all know I suppose, the military ode. You know, they shall grow not old, etc. The Navy added another verse to it. I don't know who wrote it, but they did. They have no grave but the cruel sea. No flowers lay at their head. A resting hulk is their tombstone, a fast on the ocean bed. Any sailor who hears that, Navy sailor, will have trouble, brushing a tear away from the eye, understandably. The men of AE1 were not forgotten. The Navy doesn't forget its people, but despite dozens of attempts over the years, they are not found for more than a century, until December 2017, in a high-tech search that happened upon them almost instantly. It was a very high-tech bit of gear they were using. AE1 lies at a depth of some 300 meters in a location kept secret to deter scavengers, for it is a war grave. And a careful inspection, the best analysts showed that she must have dived, but a hatch had been left open either by accident or mechanical failure, allowing the sea to flood in and send her plunging to her death. There was no reason for her to dive, perhaps, unless she felt she discovered an enemy. There was a small German patrol boat up there that hadn't been captured, and it did have a gun on the deck. Maybe she saw that. We don't know. There's no way of telling. But she did dive when she was actually on the way back to port and had no need to. So that's what got her, a hatch left open. She's astonishingly well preserved, as I said, a war grave. And the position of her hydroplanes, that is the horizontal rudders, showed very clearly that her captain, Tom Besant, had been desperately trying to bring her back to the surface, but to no avail. Didn't work. Her sister submarine, AE2, was also lost in the First War. And her story is truly historic, a magnificent saga, and I loved exploring it and writing it, not least because she is an intimate part of the Anzac legend of Gallipoli. When we think of Gallipoli, everyone thinks khaki, slouch hats, troops storming ashore on the beach. The Navy was actually there first, in the person of, or in the shape of AE2. And her captain, Harry Stoker, was a dazzling character who left a fascinating memoir he called Straws in the Wind. AE2 was British built, they all were in those days, about 750 tons, which is absolutely tiny by today's standards, 55 meters long. When they came out to Australia from Portsmouth in 1914, no submarine had ever before made it into the Southern Hemisphere. They were the first, let alone voyaged all the way to Sydney. Harry Stoker himself was an Irishman. And when you write a book like this, you can get to know your characters pretty well. Not like writing a novel. You can't make them up. You can't actually create them from scratch. But if you're lucky, and they've left behind memoirs and diaries and letters, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, a long recorded interview, you can get to know them often quite intimately. You can paint the portrait pretty well. I came to like Harry Stoker a lot, and I'd love to have met him. Now, he was good looking, he was dashing, he was debonair, he was an accomplished sportsman at cricket, tennis, polo, a bit of a playboy, as sailors I'm told can be. He called himself a philanderer, his words. which indeed he was, radiating charm and vitality, and what appears to have been a magnetic attraction for women. In the foreword to his book, he wrote this, and it gives you a great clue to his character. With indulgent smile and jest on lip, I like to wave an airy hand and murmur, "Look at it all, what funny folk we are, how seriously we take ourselves. We live, we laugh, we love, we weep, we war, we waste away, oh so seriously, as if the world hinged on our petty doings. We strut with such an air of importance around our tiny spinning ball, a speck in the inscrutable, unfathomable depths of the universe." It's nice, isn't it? Harry enjoyed life too. He doesn't say it, but reading between the lines of his memoirs, you do get the hint that he played around a little. His first submarine command was based in Gibraltar, the Rock as they called it, pre-1914. Here's his description of a Sunday at leisure there. "I well remember an evening on the North Front racecourse when a Navy and Army cricket match was in progress. I had collected some runs and was having a late tea at peace with the world. A band was playing. The governor and the beauteous ladies of the garrison were making a social function of the occasion. The sun was sinking in the west, but a nearly full moon had already risen in the east. A football match was being played on an adjacent ground, some polo ponies were exercising, and a couple of racehorses were doing gallops around the track. I noted it all. And as the last touch, hounds came into sight, returning to kennels after exercise. Sun and moon, cricket and football, horses and hounds, bands and beauteous ladies, all at the same moment. What more can anyone ask?" It gives you a great clue to his character, the man he was. He was also very good at his job, a thoroughly professional naval officer and submariner. And in 1915, he was a 30-year-old lieutenant commander, and he had pleaded with the RAN to take AE2 back to the Northern Hemisphere and into the war. And so he and his boat became a cog in the great machine of that ill-fated Gallipoli campaign. After one false start, he took AE2 into the narrow Dardanelles Strait on the morning, in fact, just after midnight of Anzac Day, the 25th of April, 1915, before the troop landings began. And so it was, as I said, in fact, the Navy was the first of the fight. The plan was to pass up through the Dardanelles to enter the Sea of Marmara, a Turkish lake, really, and as he was ordered, to run amuck on Turkish shipping carrying men and supplies to the army ashore on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, this was incredibly dangerous. No one had ever done it. He had no navigation aids, none of your newfangled radar, no sonar, no nothing, no depth sounder, any of that stuff. He had to thread his way up the strait, below the surface, largely by guesswork and dead reckoning, with the occasional glimpse of a periscope. There were Turkish forts with searchlights and guns on either side, and he had to go through minefields, 3 of them. They could hear the mooring wires of the mines scraping on the hull as they went. One false or unlucky move, one of the wires getting snagged somehow on the boat, would have brought a mine down on them and blown AE2 sky high. And they knew that. They knew the risks they were running. But they did it. He did it. And that night, Stoker surfaced and sent a wireless message back to the Admiral saying he'd made it, a feat nobody had really thought possible. And that was a crucial, pivotal moment in the whole Anzac campaign. The landing of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps that day had been a disaster, in the wrong place, so bad, so bloody, that the commanders ashore were recommending a retreat, that the troops be taken back off the beach and the invasion abandoned. It was that serious. That night, in the Admiral's cabin of the battleship Queen Elizabeth, the Admiral was there, the commanding general, Ian Hamilton, was there, and they were contemplating this awful possibility of utter failure of this vast enterprise, considering a retreat. Sunk in gloom they were when Harry Stoker's wireless message was brought into the room. One of the senior naval officers there read it out and exclaimed, "It's an omen. The Australian submarine has done the finest feat in submarine history and is going to torpedo all the ships bringing reinforcements, supplies, and ammunition into Gallipoli." And the mood in the room was electrified. The gloom vanished. Hamilton picked up his pen and wrote an order for the Anzacs to stay and keep fighting, finishing up with a PS that read, I quote it exactly, "You've got through the difficult business. Now you only have to dig, dig, dig until you are safe." And that was the origin of the name Digger, which the Australian soldier has proudly carried ever since. Started there. Harry Stoker and AE2 did indeed run amok as directed, but the odds were heavily against them. And after 5 days, they were hunted down by a Turkish gunboat, which pumped some shells into the submarine's hull, and that was it. She could no longer submerge, and so she was forced to surrender. Harry scuttled the submarine so the Turks would not get her, remembering these were very high-tech beasts in there, the high-tech stuff in their day, lots of secret stuff on board. Quaint as they look now, but then they were cutting edge. And he and his men spent the rest of the war in captivity, in conditions that were often appalling and terrifying. And their exploits, not just his, but the exploits and escapades of some of his sailors as POWs, are an extraordinary story too, and almost unknown in Australia. Everyone knows about Changi and the Burma-Siam Railway, not what these guys endured. After the war, Harry Stoker got back to London at the end of 1918, only to find that his wife had had 3 different children by 3 different men. It must have been a heavy blow, and he doesn't mention it in his memoirs, I guess for obvious reasons, but he went back to the Navy for a while, found that it no longer had any appeal for him. So he quit, and of all things, he became a successful actor and playwright on the London West End stage and in the movies. He probably should have got a Victoria Cross. A couple of the other submariners who followed him up the Dardanelles later on did indeed win the VC. But no luck for him. He died in 1966 on his 81st birthday, leaving an immortal name in the Royal Australian Navy and its submarine service. AE2 was found on the bottom of the Sea of Marmara in 1998 by a combined Turkish and Australian expedition. There were thoughts of raising her as a museum, but thank heavens they didn't. She's abandoned. She still lies there with buoys around her to keep fishermen away from the wreckage. We had no submarines in the Second World War, none at all, only surface ships. But a good few Australians, officers and sailors, volunteered to serve in British boats, submarines of the Royal Navy, and they did so with a distinction out of all proportion to their numbers. And again, one of the pleasures of writing this book, and I hope of you reading it, is to encounter characters that you like and admire. World War II produced quite a few of them, and another of my favourites in this book is a bloke named Ian McIntosh, who came from a grazing family in Victoria's Western District, Geelong grammar boy. His parents wouldn't let him join the Navy at 13, so he, as they did in those days, kids. But when he was 18, he found out there was a handful of scholarships to enter the Royal Navy for boys from the Dominions. And to everyone's surprise, including himself, he won one. And so in 1937, still a teenager, aged 18, he took himself off to Britain into the Naval College, and he graduated top of his class, just in time as a newly minted sub-lieutenant, just in time for the start of World War II. He was intrigued by submarines, he did the training, and by 1941 he was posted from Portsmouth to join his first boat in the Mediterranean. The merchant ship taking him there was torpedoed and sunk off the coast of West Africa, sunk by a German surface raider. And so at the age of 21, Ian McIntosh found himself in charge of one of the lifeboats. Now, he was not the only naval officer on board, and he wasn't the senior either, but he was the only seaman. There was a lieutenant commander, but he was a firefighting specialist, knew nothing about the sea, and the rest were reservist or supply officers, some who'd never been to sea before. So by general agreement, this kid, 21, took command. And he made a momentous seaman's decision. Now, the obvious thing would have been to head for the nearest land, the coast of West Africa, roughly 1,000 kilometres away. But Lifeboat 7, that was its number, Lifeboat 7 had no motor, only sails, and it was a heavy wooden lump of a thing. And the prevailing winds came from the wrong direction. They blew away from Africa. It would have blown the boat away from the African shore, the wrong direction. So Ian, with his seaman's knowledge, decided they should allow those trade winds to carry them southwest all the way across the Atlantic to make for the coast of Brazil, some 2,500 kilometres away. And so they set off. Without navigation instruments, they had no charts, no sextant to shoot the sun, just a small hand compass and a wristwatch. And the story of that voyage, that Odyssey, is perhaps the most extraordinary tale of the sea I've ever come across. It matches Bligh's journey in the Pacific after the mutiny on the Bounty. And in fact, Mackintosh had actually read Bligh's journals, so he had a rough idea of what to expect. Now, I won't go into the details, we'll be here all night, but it took 23 days of misery and horror, of hunger and thirst and sickness and death. 3 weeks and 2 days alone on the ocean, with virtually nothing to eat, just tins of condensed milk and a few boxes of ship's biscuit. This boat was grossly overcrowded. It had 82 people on board. It was licensed to carry 53. Of the 82 people, 44 of them died of hunger or thirst or madness brought on by drinking salt water, to be thrown overboard. They could do nothing else. In a calm sea, the bodies lifeless bobbed around the boat. They tried their best, if they were Europeans, to give them some sort of a funeral, trying to remember the words of the Book of Common Prayer, whatever. Many of the passengers were Indians, Sikhs, and Indians on the way back home from Britain. But that was the journey they made. There was nothing else for it. But the young Ian Mackintosh held the remainder together. Those who lived, he held them together by force of character, by an iron will, indomitable, matchless courage, and extraordinary seamanship. Blackened by the sun, as skinny as skeletons, they made it through and reached land on the Brazilian coast, almost exactly when and where he had calculated. And again, his story is barely known. As I was researching it, I talked to a lot of Navy people, some of them very senior, and they never heard of him. When I told it to them, they were quite gobsmacked by the achievement. Back in the UK, restored to health, Ian commanded submarines through the war with distinction, and he eventually ended up as a vice admiral with a knighthood, and he was deputy chief of the British Defence Staff. But he was always proud to call himself an Australian. He died in 2003, always as an Australian. And he would say that his proudest moment, greatest moment of his career, was when, as captain of the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious in the 1960s, he brought her into Garden Island in Sydney, and there was his mum waiting for him on the dock. It's a great story. Still more characters, more fascinating men. And I'm sorry if this is so blokey, so masculine, but that's the way it was. The times I've written about, there were not women in submarines. Women served with distinction in World War II, as you know. None of them in subs. That took a long while to happen. Another youngster by the name of Max Sheehan set off to the UK in search of adventure. He was an engineering student at the University of WA when the war broke out. He'd done a lot of messing about in boats on the Swan River. So he volunteered for the Navy, and they gave him a sub-lieutenant's uniform and some quick basic training before shipping him off to Britain in 1941 at the age of 23. They called it the Empire Yachtsman Scheme, and it wasn't a bad idea. The British were in desperate need of people who knew a bit about boats. So if you'd done a bit of peacetime sailing, knew port from starboard and bow from stern, they snapped you up pretty quickly. They gave you a sub-lieutenant single stripe, sent you out to the anti-submarine school at Rushcutters Bay in Sydney, taught you how to hunt submarines, and then they packed you off to Britain, which is what happened to Max. He served in a surface ship at first, a corvette, HMS Bluebell, escorting convoys in the Battle of the Atlantic. And his stories of that life are fascinating. The hunt for submarines, the war that nearly cost Britain her lifeline. If you've ever read Nicholas Montserrat's novel of The Cruel Sea, well, that was it. Max Sheehan was there, battling the U-boats up to his neck in it. And I love writing about that. It was exciting. And I came to like and admire him too through his engaging memoir, which he called Corvette and Submarine. He was brave and he was modest about his deeds and achievements, which were by any measure absolutely, totally and utterly heroic. For in 1942, he volunteered for what they called midget submarines. Now, these are an entirely new thing. The Italians had some from the very beginning of the war. In fact, they pioneered the idea of the midget submarine, manned in their case by two men, and they're very successful with them. They sank a couple of British battleships in the harbour at Alexandria in Egypt in the Mediterranean. And after they did that, Churchill thought, we better have a few ourselves. And so he set in motion, he turned the wheels for the British to design these boats in absolute top secrecy. The few people in the know officially called them X-craft, but midget submarines they were, designed specifically to sneak undiscovered into ports and harbours to sink enemy shipping. The first lot of these X-craft were not quite 16 metres long. So, put it another way, they're a good bit shorter than a cricket pitch. They were powered by a diesel engine, exactly the same as those used in the famous London red buses of the day, which meant they could manage about 6 knots on the surface and perhaps 4 submerged. You can swim almost as fast as that. Originally, they had a crew of 3 men, 2 officers, captain and first lieutenant, and then an engineer who was usually an enlisted man, a sailor, probably a petty officer. And that later became 4 when they added a specialist diver. They carried no guns or torpedoes, just 2 big explosive charges in canisters, one fastened on each side of the X-craft underwater. And the idea was that the diver would slip out of the X-craft. There was a water lock, a chamber there. You'd pop up into the chamber, pump it full of water, out she'd go, and so on, and come back the reverse. You would release the explosive charges on either side of the boat, and then place it beneath the hull of the German battleship or whatever your target was, set the timer, and then off you'd go, back to the submarine, and the X-craft would vanish. Sounds as simple as that, doesn't it? But it was an enterprise of the utmost difficulty and peril, in which many lives were lost. This midget submarine squadron trained in an isolated Scottish loch in absolute top secret, just a little out of Glasgow, off the River Clyde. There were 4 other Australians there with Max. In fact, quite a lot of Australians in this submarine who volunteered for this hazardous work. All of them in their early 20s, and all of them quite literally burning for action. They were excited by the job. And their first operation would be to attack the great German battleship Tirpitz, which was lying hidden away in a lonely fjord in the far north of Norway. Tirpitz was a sister ship of the Bismarck, which had already been dealt with. She'd been sunk in 1941. The Tirpitz still survived, and there she was in this lonely fjord in far northern Norway, but posing an existential threat to the Arctic convoy supplying Soviet Russia. It was dubbed Operation Source. Now, in September 1943, 6 of these midget submarines set off. They had to be towed all the way across the North Sea by larger conventional submarines, all the way from northern Scotland to that fjord. Now, one of the big submarines doing the towing was, incidentally, captained by our old mate Ian McIntosh from the lifeboat. And it was a bold and daring enterprise. One of the Australians was lost, a bloke named Henty Creer, who was in command of the midget submarine X5, and who simply vanished, never to be found again. He got his submarine close to the Tirpitz, but nobody knows what happened after that. There were reports of a submarine briefly breaching the surface, like a breaching whale, but they were never confirmed. The Germans sent out a launch with depth charges, and that maybe got him. But after the war, despite several searches, nothing was ever found of him. His mother, Henty Creer's mother, decided that he might have got ashore somehow, and that he was living with the indigenous people, the Sami people of northern Norway. She spent a year traveling around in a tiny little car, a Hillman Minx, going from village to icebound village, trying to find him. She never did. Max Sheehan, the bloke from Western Australia, he was a diver on the expedition, assigned to the submarine X9. Now, I'll give you a flavour of his experience. On the way north, being towed, X9 simply disappeared, just vanished. The tow line from the big submarine had snapped, and she was lost, probably weighed down by the remains of the tow line attached to her bow, just weighed her under. So she was lost, gone forever, with the 3 men of her crew in the middle of the vast wastes of the North Sea. Now, at that stage, Max was travelling in the big submarine. They had 2 crews for these midgets, a passage crew, as they called it, who was to take the submarine to the launch point, and then the operational crew took over. Max was in the operational crew. But the big submarine too then struck trouble because the broken tow line had snagged around one of its propellers. So the submarine was stopped. It lay there wallowing in the ocean, unable to move. And the young man from Perth was sent overboard to fix it. Now imagine this. It is the Arctic Ocean in September, the water temperature less than 5 degrees, just above freezing. The weather was clear and the sea was calm and still. But Max did not have his diving suit, which would have afforded him some protection. That had gone down with X9. All he could wear against the icy cold was a pair of seaman's overalls. And the captain said, well, you better make it quick too, because if we sight an aircraft, they'll have to submerge and leave you. So over he went. And here's a little of what he did in his own words. I'll read it to you. The water was absolutely clear. In the few moments that I could remain submerged, I noticed the shafts of sunlight descending into the depths. It made me feel giddy. I tried to see the propellers, but as the submarine pitched in the heavy swell, the hydroplane smacked the surface with an almighty splash, which forced me to the surface again. I was cold all over and more frightened than I've ever been, but there was no giving up. I swam along the surface to get clear of the hydroplanes and looked down. And there were the infinite beams of light converging towards the great deep, and there was the port propeller with the rope around it. Not tight, but in a big loop. Now, miraculously, he managed to free that rope, and he clambered back on board, frozen solid, stiff and blue with cold, but alive to fight another day. And the expedition went on into the fjord. They didn't sink the Tirpitz. but they damaged her so badly that she played no further part in the war. Two of the submarine captains won a Victoria Cross for it. And they were captured by the Germans, treated quite well, actually, all things considered, and they survived as prisoners of war. Max Sheehan lived to fight on another day. In another exploit, this time in command of a midget boat, he attacked a floating dock in the Norwegian harbour of Bergen, and then sent out to the Pacific in 1945. He took his little boat to the mouth of the Saigon River at what is now Vung Tau in Vietnam, a name that Vietnam veterans will know pretty well. And there, they cut the communications cable that ran from Tokyo to Singapore. It was important. The Americans and the Australians had cracked the Japanese codes, and they could listen to what was happening on radio, on wireless. But a lot of the stuff was transmitted from Tokyo to Singapore by cable, and that they couldn't hear. Cutting the cable was a massive achievement towards the end of that war. And that was his last hurrah in combat. With that done, and the war over, he quietly went back to his engineering studies at the University of WA, and that was it. He died in 2009. Two other Australians died in midget submarines, lost in the stormy waters of the Pentland Firth, north of the Scottish mainland. Another man, Lieutenant Ken Hudspeth, a Tasmanian, wrote his own chapters of the story. He'd been on the Tirpitz raid, got back by the skin of his teeth. And his last fling in X-boats, the midgets, was on D-Day, where he was the first Australian there, one of the first ever, of anyone. They sent him off to the Normandy beaches to act as a floating guide, a floating signpost for the invading Allied armies. And he waited there, submerged for 2 days, occasionally popping up just to get a bit of air into the boat, coming under German fire. He waited there until D-Day itself, the 6th of June, 1944, when he rose on cue and shone a blaze of lights out to sea, back towards Britain, to show the way. The first Australian at D-Day. And he was there to see this oncoming armada, this extraordinary invasion, the likes of which had never been seen before, and I guess never will be again. And he left the Navy after the war and went back to being a school teacher in Tasmania. He won the Distinguished Service Cross, the DSC, 3 times, DSC and 2 bars. He died in 2000. The RAN did not get properly serious about its submarine force until the 1960s, when it bit the bullet and bought 6 boats from the British known as the Oberon class, or sometimes just the O boats. They had all names beginning with O: Ovens, Oxley, Onslow, Otway, Orion, and Atama. And these would become the spear point of Australia's defence in the era of the Cold War. And, when we think of ourselves as Australians, we have this image of the wide brown land, the bush, sunlit plains extended, all that stuff. But in fact, as you know, we are a maritime nation, girt by sea. Our shores are washed by 3 of the world's great oceans, the Pacific, the Southern Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. And we live by trade on the sea, our exports and our imports. And it is the Navy which guards that maritime commerce. The Oberon submarines were a crucial part of that defence, remaining in service until the last of them, HMAS Atama, was decommissioned and sold off in 2000. Now, writing about them was perhaps the most difficult part of the book, because so much of what they did was and remains top secret. A lot of their time at sea was spent gathering intelligence, quietly shadowing Soviet ships in the Pacific, or just sitting quietly undiscovered in the South China Sea, just watching and listening. Often they carried specialist civilian intelligence officers and linguists on missions so shrouded in secrecy that only the captain and his navigating officer knew where they were. And looking at this for the book was quite difficult, because every sailor who served on these spook boats, as they call them, was required to sign an oath of secrecy for life. They can't talk about it. But there was enough on the record to put together a reliable picture of what they did and how they did it, and it forms the the final third of the book. They would get within meters of, say, a Soviet cruiser and photograph and film it from below to get an idea of its hull shapes, what it did to get a sound signature, as they called it, for recognition of the ship. They did extraordinary things. And the Oberon class were brilliant boats that served the nation well. There's still a few around. There's one at the Maritime Museum in Sydney, actually. It's beautifully preserved, as if a crew had just left it. So I'd like to finish up with the words from the man who inspired the book, the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond. In his foreword, he wrote, "The rules-based order that has enabled good order at sea and underpinned Australian and global prosperity since the end of World War II is now challenged." And he wrote this before Trump became president. See what's happened since. He says, "Now challenged in our times. Free and open access to the sea can no longer be assumed, so it must be assured. This is why the RAN will continue to cultivate and progress our world-renowned submarine capability through the character and competence of our people. Our Navy is charged with safeguarding our national prosperity. It is not a responsibility taken lightly." Now, I make no predictions in this book. It's not my job. I'm one of the few people in Australia who is not an expert on AUKUS. Everybody else knows all about it. But I do hope that the book shines a lantern on the stern, as they say. Submariners were and are truly fine Australians. So thanks for listening. Thanks for inviting me. As I said, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. And if you want to have a whack at some questions, I'm willing to try and answer them for you.
Thank you, Mike. That's tremendous. And you've invited people to have questions, so go at it. Andrew Boatman.
Thank you, Mike. I recall as a young midshipman in the Seaman branch in the early 80s being force marched down to Platypus and walking through the interior of one of the O-boats.
Right. And not for me, he said. I bet you.
I can affirm this, the odour, and I don't think any of our group signed up. I also recall thinking that I thought these submariners are seriously weird. I wasn't tempted later because we then heard stories, for example, and you talked about the risks of, for example, in the Tasman Sea, a submarine diving, leaving 2 sailors on the conning tower, gone.
That happened, so, yeah. Two were left up top, yeah.
Yeah, so those stories, as I say, submariners, I thought they're a bit strange. What did the submariners that you talked to identify as the definitive personal qualities that drew them to service of the nature that you've described? And I know the context, Navy has continuing difficulty recruiting for submarines.
Yeah, they're quite reticent about that. They won't say why they did it. They're proud to have done it. They speak volumes of the camaraderie. They got paid extra. That was something. But they saw themselves as an elite corps, and they did it with a genuine ideal of service, very proudly. To have won your Dolphins, which is, when you know as a naval officer, you won your Dolphins, you'd achieved a great deal. To have passed what they called the Perisher, the test for command, was a huge achievement as well. Ian McDougall, who was the first submariner to be Chief of the Navy, wrote a lot about that. And he says, we could have detailed our operations and told our war stories out loud, sung our own praises and waved our own banners. We could have had our pictures in the paper and our heads on television. And the public would have listened and watched and loved us because this country is hungry for heroes. But we chose not to. We had other priorities: the efficient and effective performance of our duties, support for our own and friendly forces, the gathering of useful intelligence, the preservation of the lives of our people, the protection of our country. We chose to keep secrets, not to tell them. And sometimes this cost us dear. That was his explanation of it. But they never quite say, well, I suppose they're probably a little reticent. But you were what they called a skimmer. They always say there are only two sorts of vessels. There are submarines and targets. Yeah, any more? No?
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Can't hear me, I suppose.
Yes, I can. I can hear someone. I can't see. Yes, yes, I can. Yeah.
Um, I'd like, yeah, um, I'd like Mike Carlton's comment on AUKUS. Any comment will do, but I'd like a lot of them.
I
Thank you.
I am in two minds. I'm really, really in two minds about it. I haven't come to a conclusion. In the naval sense, we would be getting the best and most advanced submarines available. There's no doubt about that. And I asked Mark Hammond, who's become a friend. I asked him, why do you want them? And he said, because our current submarines are old and getting outdated. They can't stay below. They have to surface or not surface, but come to the surface and put up a mast to suck in air, called a snort. And he said that is now very easily detectable. A nuclear boat can remain concealed. So that's one reason. We would get a very high-tech version of those boats, particularly when the new British boats are built. Whether we're going to get them, I don't know. The Americans are having trouble building enough for themselves. Now, with Trump so utterly unpredictable in the White House, he could easily say, no, stuff you. We can't give you any. Sorry, and we'll keep you $800 million, but sorry, we can't fit you out. Now, we don't know if that's going to happen or not. Whether or not it sucks us tighter into the American orbit, that we become merely a sort of puppet state of the United States, I don't know. I tend to think that ship has already sailed. We have relied on the United States to help defend us, since May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. So much of our equipment is American, not just the Navy, the Air Force as well, their aircraft. Our communication systems, our weapon systems are American. We are indelibly linked, insolubly linked to the United States for our defence. So there's just no argument about that. Now, people have suddenly said, "Oh, AUKUS are going to do it." We're already there. AUKUS doesn't make that much difference. We are tied to the United States. They have B-52 bombers up in Darwin now. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your politics, I guess. But there we are. So I'm in two minds. And
Thank you.
I don't know that Trump can be trusted. I would add that. I mean, does anyone think you can trust Trump to do the same thing today that he said he was going to do yesterday? I don't think you can.
Well, that's getting to be an entirely other topic, isn't it?
It is a bit, yeah, but it's quite extraordinary.
Silly man in charge.
Look, if there's no more questions, I'll thank you very much, Mike. That was really insightful.
Oh, I'm glad you say that. That's kind of you. Thank you. I say it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So I've got a few little bits of business to do. You can sit and listen, or you can sign
I
off.
might leave it because my wife is signaling in the background that dinner is ready, so I might go and do it.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
So you'll be sending out some information, I think, Justin, for Mike, and I see it's for sale just about everywhere.
Yep.
Um,
Pick your favorite.
Sorry, keep going.
I just pick your favorite and find a copy of the book.
Excellent. And we're still in business with Zoom. We've got another session due for the 16th, Wednesday, the 16th of April this year. Dr. Peter Stanley, he'll be presenting the Ellenville disaster, notorious or forgotten, and there'll be detail coming out about that. And last but not least, we have Jason wants to talk about a conference that's come up. The anniversary of the bombing of Darwin is today. 19th of February 42 was the day that the war came to Australia. How many years is that? Did you work that out, Justin?
No,
Jason? Not Justin, Jason. Um,
it's some.
it's some, yes, it's quite a sum. We have a one-day conference on the 10th of May at Caulfield RSL called Menace at Home, Australia Under Attack in 1939 to 1945, and hear about the many ways Australia was threatened and attacked, including over 1,000 air, sea, and land attacks during World War II. There's a whole lot of issues that we'll discuss, and there'll be more information coming out as we go on. So with that, look forward to seeing you at the conference. But with that, we'll bring this session to a close. Thanks to Mike and Jason, who kept everything going behind the scenes as always. Thank you for joining us, and come again. So good night to you from the committee and myself.